All right, welcome back to the deep dive. We're jumping into some really thought-provoking material you sent over.
Yeah, these excerpts titled Nihilism versus Baha'i Vision, The Crisis of Meaning. Pretty heavy stuff.
Definitely. So our mission today is basically to unpack these sources, try and understand the core ideas behind what they present as two really different ways of looking at life's purpose.
And the material itself kicks off by talking at this idea of a crisis of meaning happening right now.
It does, which sets the stage, really.
Yes, and what struck me immediately is how the source emphasizes the significance of this whole topic.
How so?
Well, it frames it as a clash, almost, between these opposing worldviews. It suggests that asking these big questions, why we're here, what matters, it's not just philosophical navel-gazing, it's actually crucial today.
Okay, so let's unpack this. Diving into the sources, it lays out what it calls the dominant Western mindset first. Scientific materialism.
Mm-hmm.
And this perspective, according to the material, makes some pretty definite claims, like life has no inherent purpose. We're just accidental evolution.
That's the gist of it, yeah. And following from that, no God, no soul, no ultimate meaning behind things like suffering.
And death is just the end, full stop.
Exactly. So the goals become, what you can get in this life. Pleasure, power, maybe building an identity for yourself.
Okay, but then the material pivots hard, doesn't it?
Completely. It introduces the Baha'i Faith as a stark contrast.
What's the core difference there, according to the source?
The vision is totally different. Human life is seen as eternal. The soul, it says, progresses forever.
So this world isn't the main event.
More like a school or a training ground. The source mentions that tests, difficulties, they're seen as having some kind of wisdom or purpose within them.
Okay, and the ultimate purpose?
Defined as knowing God, developing virtues, spiritual qualities, and serving humanity.
Gotcha. Now, the source you shared seems pretty clear that it thinks that first view, the materialist one, leads to some serious problems.
It does. It explicitly says it leads to significant issues, both for individuals and society.
So let's dig into that first. What arguments does the source mention for scientific materialism? Or maybe the arguments against meaning that go with it?
Well, it touches on a few things. It brings up the idea that the universe itself doesn't seem to have any observable purpose. Mentions figures like Stephen Hawking, Richard Dawkins in that context.
Right, the sort of cold, indifferent universe idea.
Exactly. And then it mentions Sam Harris, linking to the idea that morality isn't some objective truth, but more like brain chemistry.
Just biology doing its thing.
Basically, yeah. Biological programming. And it also touches on existentialist philosophy, the idea that religion is maybe a nice story, but ultimately we're the ones who have to create our own meaning from scratch.
So those are some of the lines of thought, but you said the source connects these directly to consequences.
Yes, and this is where it gets quite pointed. It doesn't just leave these ideas floating in abstraction. It links them to tangible, real-world outcomes.
Okay, like what kind of negative outcomes does it point to?
Several things. It talks about a kind of spiritual emptiness, a void, and it links this to rising rates of depression, addiction, even suicide.
Wow, okay.
And then there's moral confusion. The source asks, if nothing ultimately matters, then why bother being good? What's the basis for ethics?
That's a fair question, if you accept the premise.
Right. And finally, it points to what it calls extreme ideologies.
What does it mean by that?
It suggests that without an inherent larger purpose, things like gender nihilism, the idea that biological sex or gender is meaningless,
good,
or pure hedonism, just chasing pleasure, or even radical political movements can sort of rush in to fill that meaning vacuum. They become substitutes, almost like new religions.
Does it give specific examples of these consequences playing out?
It does. For existential despair, it raises the question, why endure suffering if it's all meaningless anyway?
A tough one.
And it points to things like rising suicide rates, especially in more secular countries, and even mentions Japan's hikikomori issue, that extreme social withdrawal, as maybe expressions of this lack of purpose.
And the consumerism link.
The argument presented is, if death is the absolute end, well, it makes sense to chase immediate rewards. Money, fame, pleasure, distractions, maybe.
The source uses that phrase, YOLO culture, right?
Exactly. You only live once, as a justification for maximizing present enjoyment because, well, there's supposedly nothing else.
Okay. And the last one, radical identity politics. How does the source explain that connection?
It suggests that if traditional anchors like biology are seen as arbitrary or meaningless, then people might latch on to constructed identities based on gender identity, race, ideology as new sources of meaning and belonging.
It mentions the I identify as movements.
Yes, interpreting those from its perspective as potentially replacing a more inherent sense of spiritual identity with a self-created one.
Right. Okay, so that paints a pretty bleak picture if you follow the source's line of argument about materialism.
It does, but then, as you said, it pivots.
And this is where it gets really interesting, I think. The material presents the Baha'i faith not just as different, but as a potential answer.
A direct contrast, yeah.
So let's look at its core teachings, according to the source. You mentioned the soul, eternal progress.
Yes. It quotes Baha'u'llah directly. The soul is eternal, and this world is a training ground. That's a central idea.
A training ground. So challenges aren't just random.
No, the source presents a view that every sorrow has meaning, every joy a deeper lesson. It reframes life's ups and downs.
And death.
Death is a doorway, not an end. That's another quote it uses. So physical death is seen as a transition, not an annihilation.
Okay, these are fundamentally different concepts. So the source must talk about the practical implications, right?
Right.
How does believing this stuff actually change how someone lives?
Absolutely. It delves into that. How does this worldview translate into lived experience?
So what are some key differences it highlights?
Well, take suffering. The source contrasts how someone might approach it. It gives an example. A Baha'i facing persecution might see it as a test to develop patience and faith. There's a purpose in this struggle.
Okay, versus
someone holding the materialist view who might see that same suffering as just pointless. Proof that life is unfair and meaningless, leading to despair.
That's a stark difference in perspective. What about gender? That came up earlier.
Right. The source states the Baha'i teaching emphasizes that male and female are complementary, equal in dignity. Biology is seen as having a sacred purpose within a framework of unity.
And the contrast presented.
It contrasts this with the view described earlier. Biology is arbitrary, identity is self-created, a detachment of identity from biological reality.
Interesting. And work. Daily life.
The material highlights the Baha'i belief that even everyday tasks, like your job, can be spiritual. Work is worship, if done with the right attitude, with love and service in mind.
As opposed to
the view presented where work is purely functional, just for survival, maybe something you endure until you can retire and escape it.
So it reframes pretty much every aspect of life.
That's the implication, yes. Purpose infuses everything.
Okay, so if the source presents this Baha'i view as an alternative, does it suggest how it could actually change things? Address that crisis of meaning?
It does. It moves towards suggesting solutions, ways this perspective could, in its view, shift the current trajectory.
How? What kind of solutions does the source propose?
One key area is science. It talks about restoring a sense of sacred purpose to science.
How does that work? Isn't science often seen as conflicting with religion?
Well, it cites the Baha'i principle. Science and religion must agree. They're seen as two harmonious paths to truth.
So it's not science or religion?
No. The example given is evolution. Instead of evolution disproves God, the perspective presented is more like evolution is the mechanism God uses. God is the ultimate cause.
Ah, okay. Reconciling them.
Exactly. Seeing science as a way to understand God's creation. Another area is replacing that nihilistic despair with hope.
How? Through the eternal soul idea.
Partly, yes. By teaching that every single soul has this destiny of eternal growth. The source gives an example of maybe a depressed young person.
Finding meaning how?
Not by chasing fleeting trends or pleasures, but by turning outwards. Finding purpose in serving others, contributing something meaningful, redirecting that energy.
That makes sense. And what about the social friction, the gender war thing it mentioned?
It brings up another Baha'i teaching. Women and men are two wings of one bird. Both must be strong.
Two wings of one bird.
Yeah. The source suggests this offers a framework for unity, not conflict. Instead of men versus women, it promotes mutual respect, partnership, strengthening the family and society together.
So putting it all together, what's the final picture the source leaves us with?
Well, it presents a really, really stark contrast, doesn't it?
Seems like it. Two completely different paths.
On one hand, the source argues that the scientific materialism it describes, if followed to its logical conclusion, leads to despair, addiction, loneliness, social fragmentation.
A pretty bleak outlook.
And on the other hand, it presents the Baha'i Faith as offering this foundation of eternal purpose, something rooted in the soul's journey.
Which provides, according to the source, moral clarity.
Right. Virtues like justice, love, patience, they aren't just social conventions, but seen as divine laws for our development. And it points towards unity in diversity.
Trying to move beyond those racial or gender conflicts by seeing everyone as equal before God.
That's the vision presented.
Yeah.
So the source essentially frames it as a choice for us, for society.
Continue down this path it calls meaninglessness.
Or embrace a vision where every single life, every experience has potentially infinite value and purpose.
And uses some strong language near the end, doesn't it? Calling the Baha'i Faith
the divine prescription for a dying civilization. Yeah, it doesn't hold back.
Wow. Okay.
Which leaves us, and you listening, with a final, quite provocative thought, drawn directly from the material to mull over.
Given these two profoundly different ways of seeing the world, can materialism, as described here, truly be replaced by a widespread, deeply felt spiritual purpose?